The autumn of 1889 brought death to Millbrook, Colorado, carried on the wind like autumn leaves. What started as a few cases of fever had transformed the once thriving mining town into a place of boarded windows and hastily dug graves. But for Clara Bennett, stepping off the dusty stagecoach with nothing but a worn carpetbag and letters from a man she'd never met, the real nightmare was just beginning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clara Bennett pressed her face against the grimy window of the Union Pacific Railroad car, watching the endless expanse of prairie grass bend and sway in the October wind. 3 weeks had passed since she'd left the cramped tenement building in Chicago. 3 weeks since she'd made the decision that would either save her life or destroy it completely. The letter crinkled in her gloved hands as she unfolded it for perhaps the 100th time since departing Illinois. The paper was good quality, cream-colored with neat penmanship that spoke of education and refinement. My dear Miss Bennett, your response to my advertisement has brought such joy to what has been a rather solitary existence here in Millbrook. I find myself counting the days until your arrival in November. The town may seem rough to someone accustomed to city life, but I believe you will find beauty in our mountain setting and purpose in our growing community. I have prepared a comfortable home for us, complete with the library you mentioned you would so enjoy. My practice here keeps me quite busy, as I am the only physician for nearly 100 miles, but I look forward to sharing quiet evenings discussing the books we both seem to cherish. Travel safely, my dear Clara. Your new life awaits. With great anticipation, Dr. Samuel Morrison. Clara folded the letter carefully and returned it to her reticule. Dr. Samuel Morrison. Even his name sounded solid, dependable. Nothing like the men who had haunted the Chicago boarding house where she'd spent the last 2 years, scraping together enough money for meals and rent by taking in sewing and mending. The memory of that final night in Chicago still made her hands tremble. Jake Sullivan, the boarding house owner's son, had cornered her in the narrow hallway leading to her room, his breath heavy with whiskey and his intentions unmistakable. She could still feel his rough hands grabbing at her dress, could still hear his slurred promises that he could take care of her if she was nice to him. The lamp she'd struck him with had left him unconscious and bleeding on the hallway floor. Clara had packed her few belongings in minutes, knowing she had perhaps an hour before Jake regained consciousness and his fury with it. The train ticket to Denver had cost her every penny she'd saved, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the hope that Dr. Morrison was as honorable as his letters suggested. Denver, next stop, Denver. The conductor's call pulled Clara from her dark thoughts. Through the window, she could see the sprawling city emerging from the prairie, smoke rising from countless chimneys, the Rocky Mountains standing sentinel. In the distance, like ancient guardians, the train station in Denver was a chaos of noise and movement. Passengers pushed past each other, porters called out destinations, and the constant hiss of steam engines filled the air. Clara clutched her carpetbag tightly, suddenly aware of how alone she was in this vast western landscape. Stage to Millbrook. A weathered man in a wide-brimmed hat stood beside a dusty stagecoach, calling out to the crowd. Last run to Millbrook before the snow flies. Anyone for Millbrook? Clara approached him hesitantly. Excuse me, sir. I need passage to Millbrook. The man looked her up and down, taking in her worn but respectable traveling dress, her carefully maintained gloves, and the small carpet bag that contained everything she owned. You sure about that, miss? Millbrook ain't exactly a place for refined ladies these days. What do you mean? Clara's heart began to race. Had something happened to Dr. Morrison? Was her carefully planned escape from Chicago about to crumble before it even began? Heard tell there's sickness up that way. Some kind of fever that's been taking folks. Course, it might just be talk. The man spat into the dust. You got family there? My intended husband. The words felt strange on Clara's tongue. Dr. Morrison was barely more than a stranger, yet he represented her only hope for a future free from men like Jake Sullivan. The stage driver shrugged. Your choice, miss. Fare's $5. We leave in an hour. $5. Clara counted the coins in her purse twice, her heart sinking as she realized the fare would leave her with less than $2 to her name. But there was no choice. Chicago was behind her, and ahead lay whatever fate awaited in Millbrook. The stagecoach held 6 passengers, including Clara. 2 were miners heading back to work claims in the mountains, their faces grim, and their conversation focused on rumors of played-out veins and worthless rock. A traveling salesman clutched his case of samples and complained constantly about the rough roads. An elderly woman in black mourning dress sat silently in the corner, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. The 6th passenger was a young man, perhaps Clara's age, well-dressed but with nervous energy that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a stove. He introduced himself as William Hartwell, a newspaper correspondent from Denver heading to Millbrook to investigate reports of the mysterious illness. They're calling it the mountain fever, he explained to Clara as the stagecoach rolled through the foothills. Started about 6 weeks ago. People just take sick and don't recover. The territorial authorities are concerned it might spread to Denver if it's not contained. Clara's blood ran cold. How many people have died? Reports vary. Could be a dozen, could be more. Communication with Millbrook has been sporadic. William leaned forward, his voice dropping. Some say the whole town might be under quarantine by now. The elderly woman in mourning spoke for the first time since boarding. My son lives in Millbrook, worked in the Silver Crown mine. Haven't heard from him in 3 weeks. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Had to come see for myself, the salesman scoffed. Probably just influenza blown out of proportion. These mountain towns love their dramatic stories. Brings in curious travelers and newspaper men. He nodded toward William. Good for business. But Clara noticed that despite his dismissive words, the salesman kept a handkerchief pressed to his nose and mouth, as if the very air might carry contamination. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the conversation died away. The autumn. Aspens were past their peak, their golden leaves now brown and falling, creating a carpet of decay along the roadside. The air grew thinner and colder, and Clara pulled her worn wool cloak more tightly around her shoulders. The landscape was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way. Towering peaks stretched toward a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at, while deep valleys disappeared into purple shadows. This was nothing like the flat prairie around Chicago or the gentle hills of her childhood in Ohio. This was a land that demanded respect, that could kill the unprepared or unwary. As the sun began to set, painting the peaks in shades of orange and red, the stagecoach rounded a bend, and the town of Millbrook came into view below them. Clara's first impression was of a settlement that had grown quickly and without much planning. Buildings clustered around what appeared to be a main street, with newer structures scattered up the hillsides, wherever the terrain would accommodate them. But something was wrong. Even from this distance, Clara could see that many of the buildings were dark. No smoke rose from most of the chimneys, despite the cold mountain air. The streets appeared nearly empty, with only a few scattered figures moving about their business. Looks mighty quiet down there, one of the miners observed. Should be more activity this time of evening. The stagecoach began its descent toward the town, the horses picking their way carefully down the steep, winding road. As they drew closer, Clara could make out more details. Some buildings appeared to be boarded up entirely. Others had what looked like red cloth tied to their doors or hung from their windows. "Dear God," William whispered, pulling out a small notebook and pencil. "Those are quarantine markers. The elderly woman pressed her face to the window, her breathing rapid and shallow. "Where is everyone? Where are all the people?" The stage. Driver's voice carried back to them from his perch above. "Hold on, folks. There's someone in the road ahead." Through the front window of the coach, Clara could see a figure standing in the middle of the main street. As they approached, she realized it was a man in a long, dark coat, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. He held up one hand in a gesture that clearly meant stop. The stagecoach came to a halt, perhaps 20 feet from the man. The driver climbed. Down from his seat, his movements careful and deliberate. "Evening, mister. This is the regular stage from Denver. Got passengers for Millbrook." The man in the dark coat stepped closer, and Clara could see more of his face in the fading light. He was perhaps 35 years old, with dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His clothes were well made, but showed signs of hard use, and there was something in his posture that spoke of authority and exhaustion in equal measure. "I'm afraid I can't allow you to proceed into town," the man said. His voice was educated, with just a hint of an Eastern accent. "Millbrook is under medical quarantine. No one enters or leaves without proper authorization. Now see here," the salesman called out from inside the coach, "I've got business in this town. You can't just stop legal commerce because of a few cases of the sniffles." The man's expression didn't change. "Dr. James McKenna, Territorial Health Officer, and I assure you, sir, this is far more serious than the sniffles. We've had 43 confirmed deaths in the past 6 weeks, with 17 more cases currently under observation." 43 deaths. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. In a town of perhaps 300 people, those numbers represented a catastrophe beyond her imagination. William was scribbling frantically in his notebook. "Doctor, I'm William Hartwell, with the Denver Post. Can you confirm the nature of this illness? Are we looking at cholera, typhoid?" "I'm not discussing medical details with the press at this time," Dr. McKenna replied curtly. "My primary concern is preventing the spread of this contagion beyond Millbrook's boundaries." Clara found her voice. "Doctor, please. I'm Clara Bennett. I'm expected in town. Dr. Samuel Morrison he's my intended husband. I've traveled from Chicago to be married." Something changed in Dr. McKenna's expression. The professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that might have been sympathy, or perhaps pity. "Miss Bennett, Dr. Morrison mentioned you might be arriving soon." "He's all right then." Relief flooded through Clara. "The quarantine hasn't affected him?" Dr. McKenna was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his words were careful and precise. "Miss Bennett, I think you should step down from the coach. We need to speak privately." The tone of his voice sent ice through Clara's veins. She knew, even before the words were spoken, that her carefully constructed hope was about to crumble around her. The other passengers watched in silence as Clara gathered her carpet bag and stepped down into the dusty street. The mountain air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and something else she couldn't identify. Something that reminded her of the Chicago hospital where her father had died years ago. Dr. McKenna gestured for her to follow him a few steps away from the stagecoach. In the growing darkness, his face was shadowed and grave. "Miss Bennett, I'm very sorry to have to tell you this. Dr. Morrison contracted the fever 8 days ago. We did everything we could, but—" He paused, searching for the right words. "He died 3 days ago. I performed the burial myself, according to quarantine protocols." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Clara felt her knees buckle, and only Dr. McKenna's quick reflexes kept her from falling to the ground. Samuel Morrison, the man whose letters had offered her salvation, whose promises of a new life had given her the courage to flee Chicago, was dead. "I'm sorry," Dr. McKenna said quietly. "I know this isn't what you expected to find." Behind them, the stagecoach passengers were growing restless. The driver called out, "Doc, we need to get these folks back to Denver before full dark." Can't navigate that mountain road in the black? Clara found herself caught between two impossibilities. She couldn't return to Chicago and the dangers she'd fled, but she couldn't enter a plague-stricken town where her only protector was dead. She had less than $2 to her name, no family to turn to and nowhere to go. "Please," she whispered, looking up into Dr. McKenna's concerned face. "I have nowhere else to go. Nothing to go back to." The doctor studied her for a moment, and Clara could see him weighing options she couldn't imagine. Finally, he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Driver," he called out, "you can head back to Denver. Miss Bennett will be staying in Millbrook." "Doc, that ain't safe," the driver protested. "That fever will be my responsibility to manage," Dr. McKenna replied firmly. "Miss Bennett is now under my medical supervision." As the stagecoach disappeared into the gathering darkness, carrying with it Clara's last connection to the world beyond Millbrook, she found herself alone with a stranger in a town touched by death. Dr. James McKenna looked down at her, this woman who had traveled halfway across a continent to marry a dead man, and Clara saw something in his eyes that gave her the first spark of hope she'd felt since stepping off the stage. "Come," he said, picking up her carpet bag. "Let's get you somewhere safe. And Miss Bennett," he paused, meeting her gaze directly, "I give you my word that as long as you're in my care, no harm will come to you." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. As she followed Dr. McKenna into the silent, quarantined streets of Millbrook, she couldn't know that she had just placed her life in the hands of the only man in 300 miles who might be able to keep that promise. For Dr. James McKenna carried within his blood something that made him unique in this plague-ravaged town: complete immunity to the disease that had killed Samuel Morrison and 42 others. And in the days to come, that immunity would prove to be the only thing standing between Clara Bennett and a death far more terrible than anything she had fled in Chicago. The streets of Millbrook were eerily quiet as Dr. McKenna led Clara deeper into the town. Her footsteps echoed off the wooden sidewalks with a hollow sound that seemed to emphasize the emptiness around them. Gas lamps flickered at irregular intervals, casting pools of yellow light that only made the shadows between them seem darker and more ominous. "Stay close to me," Dr. McKenna said quietly, "and don't touch anything unless I tell you it's safe." Clara nodded, gripping her carpetbag tighter. As they passed the buildings lining Main Street, she could see more clearly the signs of a community under siege. The red quarantine markers Dr. McKenna had mentioned were everywhere. Cloth strips tied to door handles, painted X marks on windows, and in some cases entire buildings sealed with boards and official notices. "How many people are left?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps 60 who haven't shown symptoms, another 20 in various stages of the illness." Dr. McKenna's voice was clinical, but Clara could hear the exhaustion beneath it. When this started, Millbrook had nearly 300 residents. The mathematics of survival were stark and terrifying. Clara had walked into a town where more than half the population was already dead or dying. Her steps faltered slightly, but Dr. McKenna noticed immediately and steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow. "Second thoughts are perfectly natural," he said. "If you want to wait for the next stage back to Denver, I'll make arrangements for you to stay somewhere safe until then." Clara considered this for a moment. The rationale part of her mind screamed that she should take his offer, should flee this place of death and disease while she still could. But where would she go? Back to Chicago and Jake Sullivan's wandering hands? To Denver with less than $2 and no prospects? At least here, with Dr. McKenna, she had some measure of protection. "No," she said finally, "I'll stay." Something in her tone must have convinced him of her resolve, because he nodded and continued walking. They passed what had once been a thriving commercial district, a general store with boarded windows, a saloon with chairs stacked on tables visible through dirty glass, a barber shop with its striped pole hanging askew. The disease came with a supply wagon from the railroad camps, Dr. McKenna explained as they walked. A teamster named Carson brought it in, though we didn't realize it at the time. He seemed healthy enough when he arrived, spent 3 days in town conducting business, staying at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. Clara glanced at a building they were passing, noting the multiple red markers on its doors and windows. Mrs. Patterson's place. 7 people died there in the first week. Mrs. Patterson was the third. Dr. McKenna's voice remained steady, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. By the time we understood what we were dealing with, it was too late to contain it within the boarding house. They turned onto a side street that seemed slightly less affected by the plague. Here, a few buildings still showed signs of life, faint lights in windows, smoke rising from chimneys. Clara felt some of the tension in her chest ease slightly. "This is where most of the survivors have gathered," Dr. McKenna explained. "We've established a kind of safe zone, though safe is a relative term. People here follow strict protocols about contact, sanitation, and isolation." As if summoned by his words, a figure emerged from one of the houses ahead. It was a woman perhaps 40 years old, wearing a practical dress and a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She approached them, but stopped a good 10 feet away. Clara noticed. "Dr. McKenna," the woman called out. "Any word from the territorial authorities? Are they sending more medical supplies?" "Not yet, Mrs. Chen, but I'm hopeful we'll hear something within the week." He gestured toward Clara. "This is Miss Bennett. She was Dr. Morrison's intended bride." Mrs. Chen's expression immediately softened with sympathy. "Oh, my dear, I'm so sorry for your loss. Dr. Morrison was a good man. He helped deliver my youngest son 3 years ago." The reminder of Samuel Morrison's life, of the man he had been beyond just letters on a page, hit Clara with unexpected force. She had been so focused on her own desperate situation that she hadn't truly mourned the death of the man who had offered her salvation. Now, faced with someone who had known him personally, the reality of her loss began to sink in. "Thank you," Clara managed. That's kind of you to say." "Dr. Morrison spoke of you often in the weeks before he took ill," Mrs. Chen continued. "He was so looking forward to your arrival, had his house all prepared, even ordered special books from Denver that he thought you'd enjoy." Clara felt tears, threatening, and fought them back. Crying wouldn't change anything, wouldn't bring Samuel Morrison back or solve her current predicament. Dr. McKenna seemed to sense her distress. "Mrs. Chen, I'm taking Miss Bennett to get settled. Please let the others know she's under my protection, and the same protocols that apply to me apply to her." Mrs. Chen nodded understanding. "Of course, Doctor. Miss Bennett, if you need anything, clothing, personal items, companionship, please. Don't hesitate to ask. We survivors need to look after each other." As they continued walking, Clara found herself curious about the protocols Dr. McKenna had mentioned. What exactly does it mean that the same protocols apply to you as to me? Dr. McKenna was quiet for a moment before answering. "I've been working with the infected since the outbreak began. I've been exposed to the disease countless times, yet I've never shown symptoms. The other survivors have noticed this, and they've begun to treat me as, well, as someone who might be naturally protected." "Protected how?" "I wish I knew." Dr. McKenna's voice carried a note of frustration. "In my medical training, I learned about various theories regarding disease resistance, but nothing that would explain my apparent immunity to whatever is killing people here." They had arrived at a neat 2-story house with a small front garden. Unlike many of the buildings they'd passed, this one showed clear signs of occupation, warm light glowing in the windows, well-maintained exterior, a thin stream of smoke rising from the chimney. "This is my home," Dr. McKenna said, opening the front gate. "And for now, it's yours as well." Clara hesitated. "Dr. McKenna, I appreciate your kindness, but I can't simply move into your home. It wouldn't be proper." "Miss Bennet, propriety is a luxury we can't afford in Millbrook right now. You have nowhere else to go, and I have an obligation to ensure your safety." He paused, studying her face in the lamplight. "If it eases your concerns, my housekeeper, Mrs. Walsh, lives here as well. She's one of the few people in town who's shown complete resistance to the disease." As if summoned by his words, the front door opened, revealing a sturdy woman in her 50s with steel-grey hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore a clean apron over a dark dress, and her expression was both welcoming and cautious. "Dr. McKenna," she called out, "I saw you coming up the street. Is this the young lady you mentioned?" "Mrs. Walsh, this is Miss Clara Bennet. She'll be staying with us for the foreseeable future." Dr. McKenna gestured for Clara to precede him up the front steps. "Miss Bennet, Mrs. Walsh has been managing my household for the past 2 years. She's also been invaluable in caring for the sick." Mrs. Walsh looked Clara up and down with the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to taking measure of people quickly. Whatever she saw seemed to meet with her approval, because she stepped aside to let them enter. "Come in, dear. You look half frozen and completely exhausted. When did you last have a proper meal?" Clara tried to remember. "Yesterday morning, I think. On the train." Mrs. Walsh made a disapproving sound. "Well, that won't do at all. Dr. McKenna, take Miss Bennet into the parlour while I prepare something hot, and both of you wash your hands thoroughly before touching anything." The interior of Dr. McKenna's house was warm and comfortable, furnished with well-made furniture and lined with bookshelves that reminded Clara painfully of Samuel Morrison's promises in his letters. A fire crackled in the parlour fireplace, and the smell of something delicious drifted from the kitchen. "Please sit," Dr. McKenna said, gesturing to a comfortable chair near the fire. "You've had enough shocks for one day." Clara sank gratefully into the chair, finally allowing herself to truly feel the exhaustion that had been building since her flight from Chicago. The warmth of the fire began to thaw not just her chilled body, but some of the fear that had been coiled in her chest since learning of Samuel Morrison's death. "Dr. McKenna," she said quietly, "why are you helping me? You don't know me, and I have nothing to offer in return." He had been standing near the window, apparently lost in thought, but her question brought his attention back to her. "Perhaps because helping you helps me remember why I became a doctor in the first place. Or perhaps because Samuel Morrison was a good man who deserved better than to die alone in a plague-stricken town. You knew him well." "Well enough. He arrived in Millbrook about 6 months before the outbreak began. The town needed a doctor, and he needed a fresh start after some personal tragedy back east. We often worked together on difficult cases." Dr. McKenna's expression grew thoughtful. "He spoke of you frequently, especially in the weeks before he became ill. He was genuinely excited about starting a new life with you." The weight of lost possibilities settled over Clara like a heavy blanket. Samuel Morrison would never get his fresh start, and she would never have the chance to discover what kind of husband and partner he might have been. Mrs. Walsh appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray laden with food, hot soup, fresh bread, butter, and what appeared to be apple pie. The sight and smell of the meal made Clara realize just how hungry she truly was. "Eat," Mrs. Walsh commanded, setting the tray on a small table beside Clara's chair. "And while you eat, we'll figure out what's to be done with you." As Clara began to eat the first hot meal she'd had in days, she listened to Dr. McKenna and Mrs. Walsh discuss the practical arrangements of her situation, where she would sleep, what work she might be able to do to earn her keep, how she would fit into the carefully maintained protocols that kept the survivors alive. But underneath their practical planning, Clara sensed something else, a determination to protect her that went beyond mere obligation. For reasons she didn't yet understand, Dr. James McKenna had taken responsibility for her welfare, and something in his manner suggested he was a man who took his responsibilities very seriously indeed. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding Clara of the vast, dangerous wilderness that surrounded this small pocket of civilization. But for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, she felt something approaching safety. Whether that feeling would prove justified remained to be seen, but for now it was enough. Clara woke to the sound of church bells tolling in the distance, their mournful tone cutting through the crisp morning air. For a moment she lay still in the unfamiliar bed, disoriented by the quality of light filtering through curtains that weren't hers. Then reality crashed back. Samuel Morrison was dead. She was stranded in a plague town, and she was entirely dependent on the kindness of a stranger. The room Dr. McKenna had given her was simple but comfortable, with whitewashed walls, a sturdy oak dresser, and a window that looked out over what had once been Millbrook's main commercial district. In the morning light, the devastation was even more apparent. Buildings stood empty with their doors hanging. Open, personal belongings scattered in the streets as if people had fled in panic. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Bennet," Mrs. Walsh's voice carried through the wood, "I've prepared breakfast when you're ready." Clara dressed quickly in the same travelling dress she'd worn for days, acutely aware that it was one of only two she owned. Everything else she possessed fit easily in her small carpet bag. Another dress, undergarments, a few personal items, and Samuel Morrison's letters. Not much to show for 26 years of life. Downstairs, she found Mrs. Walsh bustling about the kitchen with the efficiency of someone accustomed to maintaining order in the midst of chaos. The older woman looked up as Clara entered, her assessment quick but not unkind. "You look better with some rest," Mrs. Walsh observed, "though that dress has seen better days. We'll need to do something about your clothing situation." "I'm afraid I have very limited funds," Clara admitted, colour rising in her cheeks. "Perhaps there's work I could do to earn—" "Nonsense." Mrs. Walsh waved away her protests. "Dr. McKenna has already made arrangements. There are resources available from those who no longer need them." The implication hung heavy in the air. The dead had left behind more than just empty houses. Dr. McKenna appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed for travel with his medical bag in hand. In the morning light, Clara could see him more clearly than she had the night before. He was perhaps 35, with intelligent dark eyes, and the kind of steady presence that probably served him well in his medical practice. His clothes were well made, but practical, and there was something in his bearing that suggested both authority and compassion. "Good morning, Miss Bennet. I trust you slept well?" His formal politeness couldn't quite hide the concern in his voice. "As well as could be expected, thank you." Clara accepted a cup of coffee from Mrs. Walsh, grateful for the warmth and the familiar ritual. "Will you be making rounds to your patients today?" "Among other things." Dr. McKenna's expression grew serious. "There are matters we need to discuss regarding your situation here in Millbrook. But first, I need to check on the Hendricks family. Their youngest daughter developed symptoms yesterday." Clara's blood chilled. "Is she—" "Too early to tell. Sometimes the young ones fight it off better than adults." But the doubt in his voice was unmistakable. After Dr. McKenna left, Mrs. Walsh led Clara on what she called a practical tour of their circumstances. They visited the cellar, well stocked with preserved foods and medical supplies, the garden behind the house, now dormant for winter but clearly well maintained, the small stable where Dr. McKenna kept his horse and medical cart. "The doctor thinks ahead," Mrs. Walsh explained as they walked. "Had to, once it became clear the territorial authorities weren't going to provide much help." "Have they abandoned Millbrook entirely?" Mrs. Walsh's expression darkened. Officially? No. They send the occasional telegram asking for updates. Unofficially? She shrugged. Easier to let a small mountain town die than risk the disease spreading. To Denver or Colorado Springs, the callousness of it shocked Clara, but surely they have an obligation. To whom? A few hundred miners and their families? People who came here chasing silver that's mostly played out anyway? Mrs. Walsh's voice carried years of accumulated bitterness. We're expendable, Miss Bennet. The sooner you understand that, the better. They were interrupted by the sound of shouting from the street. Through the kitchen window, Clara could see a man running toward Dr. McKenna's house, his face flushed. With panic, Mrs. Walsh moved to the door but kept it closed. "What is it, Mr. Garrett? Need the doc?" the man called out, stopping a safe distance from the house. "It's Martha Hendricks. She's taken a turn." The little girl Dr. McKenna had gone to check on. Clara felt her heart sink. Dr. McKenna left for the mining office an hour ago, Mrs. Walsh called back. "Try there, or send someone to fetch him." After the man hurried away, Mrs. Walsh closed the window and turned back to Clara. "This is what life is like here now. Crisis after crisis, and never enough time or resources to address them all properly. How do you bear it?" Mrs. Walsh was quiet for a moment, studying Clara's face. "You learn to focus on what you can control and let go of what you can't. The alternative is madness." Later that morning, Mrs. Walsh took Clara to what had been Dr. Morrison's house. It was a neat, two-story building on the better side of town, with a small front garden and carefully maintained exterior. Despite everything, Clara felt her breath catch as she approached the door. This was where she was supposed to have started. Her new life. Mrs. Walsh produced a key from her pocket. "Dr. McKenna thought you should see it. Decide what you want to do with his belongings." The interior was exactly as Samuel Morrison had described in his letters: comfortable furniture, well stocked. Bookshelves, everything arranged with the care of a man, expecting to share his space with someone special. In the parlor, Clara found the books he had mentioned ordering from Denver, still in their shipping crate, never opened. "He was excited about those," Mrs. Walsh said softly. "Talked about discussing them with you in the evenings." Clara picked up one of the books, a volume of poetry by Walt Whitman. An inscription on the title page read, "For Clara, may these words bring us closer together. With love and anticipation, Samuel." The tears she had been holding back finally came, not just for Samuel Morrison, but for the life they would never have together, the conversations they would never share, the future that had died with him. Mrs. Walsh allowed her to cry without interruption, standing quietly by the window until Clara's sobs subsided. "I'm sorry," Clara said, wiping her eyes with her handkerchief. "I don't usually—" "You've held up remarkably well," Mrs. Walsh interrupted. "Most people would have collapsed by now." They spent the next hour going through Samuel Morrison's possessions. His clothes would be donated to those in need. His medical books would go to Dr. McKenna. Personal items, letters from family, photographs, mementos would be carefully packed and saved, perhaps to be returned to relatives back east, if any could be located. But it was in his desk that Clara made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden in a secret compartment was a leather portfolio containing documents that made no immediate sense to her. Correspondence with officials in Denver, detailed maps of the region around Millbrook, and what appeared to be geological surveys of the local mining claims. "Mrs. Walsh," Clara called, holding up one of the letters. "Look at this." The letter was dated just 2 weeks before Samuel Morrison's death, addressed to someone named Colonel Harrison in Denver. The content was cryptic but troubling. "Colonel Harrison, your concerns about the situation in Millbrook are well-founded. The disease is not behaving as any natural pathogen I've encountered in my medical practice. The progression is too uniform, the mortality rate too consistent. I've begun to suspect that what we're dealing with is not entirely natural in origin. I've documented several anomalies that I believe warrant investigation by territorial authorities. The timing of the outbreak, the specific populations affected, and the curious immunity displayed by certain individuals all suggest a pattern that bears closer examination. I will continue my investigation, but I fear I may have attracted unwanted attention. If something should happen to me, please ensure that these documents reach the proper authorities. Respectfully, Dr. Samuel Morrison. Mrs. Walsh read the letter twice, her expression growing more troubled with each reading. "This changes things," she said quietly. "If Dr. Morrison suspected the plague wasn't natural, what are you suggesting?" "I don't know, but we need to show this to Dr. McKenna immediately." They were interrupted by the sound of horses in the street outside. Looking through the window, Clara saw 4 riders approaching the house, their faces hard and their weapons visible. These weren't townspeople she recognized from her brief time in Millbrook. "Get away from the window," Mrs. Walsh whispered urgently, "and gather those documents. Quickly!" Clara stuffed the papers into her coat as the riders dismounted outside. Their leader, a tall man with a graying beard and expensive clothes that seemed out of place in the rough mountain town, approached the front door. "Dr. Morrison," he called out, "we know you're in there. We need to talk." Mrs. Walsh and Clara remained silent, barely breathing. "Dr. Morrison, we represent certain interests that are concerned about your recent correspondence with Denver. We'd like to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement." When no answer came, the man's voice grew harder. "Search the house," he ordered his companions. "Find anything that looks like medical records or official correspondence." Clara's heart hammered in her chest as she heard the men moving around the exterior of the house, testing windows and looking for alternate entrances. The documents she carried suddenly felt like they weighed 100 pounds. Mrs. Walsh grabbed Clara's arm and led her quickly toward the back of the house. "There's a root cellar behind the kitchen," she whispered. "We can hide there until they leave." But as they reached the back door, Clara heard the sound of breaking glass from the front of the house. The men were coming inside. "Too late," Mrs. Walsh breathed. "Is there another way out?" Clara looked around desperately, then remembered something. From her childhood visits to her grandmother's house. "The chimney," she whispered, "in the parlor. It connects to the one upstairs. If we can reach the second floor." They crept back through the house, staying low and moving as quietly as possible. Behind them, Clara could hear the men ransacking the front rooms, searching through furniture and papers. "Nothing here," one of them called out. "Check upstairs." Clara and Mrs. Walsh barely made it to the second floor before they heard heavy footsteps on the stairs below. In the master bedroom, Clara found what she was looking for, the fireplace that connected to the main chimney system. "You can't be serious," Mrs. Walsh whispered, looking at the narrow opening. "It's our only choice." Clara was already removing her coat and trying to calculate if she could fit through the space. "I'm smaller than you. I'll go first and then help you." The sound of doors opening and closing grew closer. Clara squeezed herself into the chimney, grateful for all the meals she'd skipped during her lean years in Chicago. The fit was tight, but she managed to work her way up to where the chimney branched, allowing her to move horizontally toward the kitchen fireplace. Behind her, she could hear Mrs. Walsh struggling to follow, cursing quietly as her larger frame fought against the narrow passage. "In here," a man's voice called from the bedroom they'd just vacated. "Fireplace is still warm. Someone's been here recently." Clara's heart sank. Their escape route had been discovered. She reached the kitchen fireplace and dropped down immediately, turning to help Mrs. Walsh, who was stuck halfway through the horizontal passage. "Go," Mrs. Walsh whispered urgently. "Take those documents and go. Find Dr. McKenna." "I'm not leaving you. You have to. Those papers might be the key to understanding what's really happening here." The sound of men in the upstairs rooms grew louder. Clara realized they would soon figure out the chimney system and follow their path. With tears in her eyes, Clara squeezed Mrs. Walsh's hand once, then slipped out the kitchen door into the cold morning air. Behind her, she could hear the men discovering Mrs. Walsh in the chimney, their voices angry and demanding. Clara ran through the back gardens and side streets of Millbrook, Samuel Morrison's documents clutched against her chest, her mind reeling. With the implications of what she'd discovered, the plague might not be natural. Someone had been looking for these papers specifically. And now, Mrs. Walsh, who had shown her nothing but kindness, was in the hands of dangerous men. She needed to find Dr. McKenna, but she didn't know where he'd gone after leaving for the mining office. The town suddenly seemed vast and full of shadows, each doorway a potential hiding place for enemies she didn't understand. As she paused in an alley to catch her breath and think, Clara realized that her situation had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just a stranded bride in a plague town. She was now the keeper of secrets that someone was willing to kill to protect. Trapped in a web of conspiracy she was only beginning to understand. The documents in her coat seemed to burn against her ribs, and Clara understood with crystalline clarity that her survival now depended not just on avoiding disease, but on staying one step ahead of people who had already proven they would stop at nothing to silence anyone who threatened their plans. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear Mrs. Walsh's voice raised in defiant anger, refusing to give her captors the information they sought. Clara said a silent prayer for the brave woman's safety and forced herself to think clearly about her next move. She needed to find Dr. McKenna, but more than that, she needed to understand what Samuel Morrison had discovered about the plague's true origins. The answer lay in the documents she carried, but deciphering their meaning would require help from someone she could trust. As Clara moved through the shadowed streets of Millbrook, she couldn't know that her discovery had set in, motion events that would either save the town or destroy what remained of it. But she was beginning to understand that her arrival in this plague-stricken place was not the end of her journey, but the beginning of something far more dangerous and consequential than she had ever imagined. The morning sun climbed higher over the mountains, but its light seemed unable to penetrate the shadows that had suddenly fallen across Clara's new world. Samuel Morrison was dead, Mrs. Walsh was captured, and Clara was alone with secrets that powerful people would kill to protect. But she was not the same frightened woman who had fled Chicago just days before. The crucible of crisis was forging her into something harder, more determined. Whatever came next, she would face it with the courage that comes not from the absence of fear, but from the refusal to let fear win. The hunt for Clara Bennett had begun, but she was no longer just prey. She was becoming something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Clara pressed herself against the cold stone wall of Murphy's General Store, her breath forming small clouds in the mountain air as she tried to calm her racing heart. The documents from Samuel Morrison's house felt like they were burning through her coat, and every shadow seemed to hide potential enemies. She had been running through Millbrook's back alleys for nearly an hour, but the sound of horses and shouting, men never seemed far behind. From her hiding place, she could see the mining office where Mrs. Walsh had said Dr. McKenna might be found. The building sat at the far end of Main Street, a sturdy stone structure that had once housed the Territorial Mining Claims Office. But getting there meant crossing open ground, and Clara had already seen too many strangers on horseback patrolling the streets to risk such exposure. A hand suddenly gripped her shoulder, and Clara spun around with a strangled gasp, ready to fight or flee. But instead of one of her pursuers, she found herself face to face with a young man she didn't recognize. He was perhaps 25, with sandy hair and clothes that marked him as a miner, but his eyes held an intelligence that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. "Easy there," he whispered, releasing her shoulder. "You're the lady who came in on yesterday's stage, aren't you?" Dr. Morrison's intended? Clara nodded warily, not trusting her voice. Name's Danny Reeves. I worked on Dr. Morrison's mine claim with him before he took sick. The young man's expression was serious. Words already spreading that strangers are in town asking questions. About the doc's papers. Mrs. Chen sent me to find you. Mrs. Chen. She saw those riders go to Morrison's place. Saw Mrs. Walsh get taken. Danny's jaw tightened. We've been watching for you ever since. Relief flooded through Clara so suddenly that her knees nearly buckled. She wasn't alone after all. Where is Dr. McKenna? I need to find him immediately. That's the problem, Danny said grimly. He's trapped in the mining office with 3 other folks. Those same riders have the building surrounded. Won't let anyone in or out. Clara's heart sank. Dr. McKenna was her only ally in Millbrook, the only person who might understand the significance of the documents she carried. Without him, she was completely on her own. There's more, Danny continued. Before they took Mrs. Walsh, she managed to get word to Mrs. Chen about some papers you found. Important ones. Clara's hand instinctively went to her coat. What exactly did she say? That Dr. Morrison suspected the plague wasn't natural. That he'd been investigating something dangerous. Danny studied her face carefully. Is it true? Clara looked into the young man's earnest eyes and made a decision that would change both their lives. Yes, and I think I know why those men are here. She pulled out one of Samuel Morrison's letters, the one addressed to Colonel Harrison in Denver. Danny read it quickly, his expression growing more troubled with each line. Jesus, he breathed. If this is true, then everyone who's died was murdered, Clara finished. The question is, who's responsible and why? Danny was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new determination. My little sister died in the second wave of the plague. Sarah was only 8 years old. He looked up at Clara. If someone deliberately caused this, I want them to pay. First, we need to get these documents to someone who can act on them, Clara said. Someone in authority outside of Millbrook. The telegraph office, Danny suggested. We could send word to Denver, to this Colonel Harrison fellow. Clara shook her head. Those riders will be watching the telegraph office. Besides, we need Dr. McKenna. He's the only one who can verify the medical evidence. Then we need to get him out of that mining office. How? You said it was surrounded. Danny smiled grimly. Lady, I've been working these mines for 6 years. I know every tunnel, shaft and crawl space in this mountain. The old Silver Crown mine connects to the basement of the mining office through an abandoned exploration tunnel. Clara stared at him. You're suggesting we go through an abandoned mine tunnel? Unless you've got a better idea. Danny's expression was serious. It's dangerous, I won't lie. Part of the tunnel flooded last spring, and there are sections where the supports are questionable. But it's the only way to reach Dr. McKenna without being seen. Clara thought of Mrs. Walsh, captured because she had tried to help. She thought of Samuel Morrison, dead because he had gotten too close to the truth. And she thought of little Sarah Reeves, 8 years old and dead from a plague that might have been deliberately unleashed. Show me, she said. Danny led her through a maze of back alleys and side streets, avoiding the main roads where the mysterious riders continued their patrols. As they moved, he filled her in on what he'd observed about their enemies. 4 men, well-armed and well-funded. Their leader's got the look about him, but he's not wearing any uniform. They've been asking specific questions about Dr. Morrison's medical research and his correspondence with Denver. How do you know all this? Mrs. Chen's been organizing the survivors since the quarantine started. We've got people watching from windows, listening at doors. In a town this size, it's hard to keep secrets. Danny paused at a corner, checking the street ahead. What we couldn't figure out was why anyone would care about a dead doctor's papers. Now I'm starting to understand. They reached the entrance to the Silver Crown mine as the sun reached its zenith. The mine opening was partially boarded up, with official notices declaring it unsafe and off-limits. But Danny produced a crowbar from a hiding place behind a pile of rocks and pried away enough boards to create an opening large enough for them to squeeze through. "Stay close and do exactly what I say," he warned as they entered the tunnel. "These old mines are death traps if you don't know what you're doing." The darkness inside was absolute, broken only by the flickering light of Danny's oil lamp. The air was cold and damp, with the mineral smell of deep earth and the distant sound of dripping water. Clara had never been underground before, and the weight of the mountain above them seemed to press down on her shoulders. "The connecting tunnel is about half a mile in," Danny explained as they walked along the old mining cart tracks. "We'll need to go through the main shaft, then down to the third level. That's where it gets tricky." As they descended deeper into the mine, Clara began to understand the scope of the operation that had once employed much of Millbrook. Side tunnels branched off in all directions, some sealed with debris, others disappearing into darkness. Abandoned mining equipment sat rusting in alcoves, and the walls showed the scars of dynamite blasts and pickaxe work. "How much silver did they take out of here?" Clara asked, partly to distract herself from the claustrophobic surroundings. "Enough to build half the town," Danny replied. The Silver Crown was the richest strike in this part of Colorado for about 3 years. Then the vein played out, and most of the miners moved on to other claims, including Dr. Morrison. He wasn't really a miner, bought his claim as an investment, but spent most of his time studying the geology of the area. Always said he was more interested in how the mountains were formed than in digging silver out of them. They reached a junction where 3 tunnels converged. Danny paused, studying the options carefully before choosing the middle passage. "This way, and watch your head. The ceiling gets lower from here." As they continued deeper into the mountain, Clara found herself thinking about Samuel Morrison in a new light. The man she had known only through letters had been more complex than she'd realized. A doctor who invested in mining claims, a scientist interested in geology, a researcher who suspected that a deadly plague might have unnatural origins. "Danny," she said as they navigated around a pool of stagnant water, "what else do you know about Dr. Morrison's research? His medical work, I mean, not the mining." He was always asking questions about the plague that the other folks couldn't answer, like why some people seemed completely immune, while others died within days, why the disease affected certain neighborhoods but not others. Why do children seem to have different survival rates than adults? Clara thought about Dr. McKenna's apparent immunity and Mrs. Walsh's resistance to the disease. Did he have any theories? He talked to me once about patterns. Said the disease was too organized, too predictable to be entirely natural. Natural plagues, he said, are chaotic. They spread randomly, affect different people differently, mutate over time. But this one followed rules, Clara finished. Understanding beginning to dawn. Exactly. Almost like someone had designed it to behave in specific ways. They were interrupted by a sound from ahead. Voices echoing through the tunnels, though too distant to make out words. Danny immediately extinguished his lamp, plunging them into absolute darkness. "Someone else is down here," he whispered. Clara's blood chilled. Had their pursuers somehow discovered the tunnel system? Were they walking into a trap? "Can we go back?" she breathed. "Too late. They're behind us too." As if to confirm his words, Clara heard the distant sound of footsteps and voices from the direction they had come. They were caught between 2 groups of unknown people in the darkness of an abandoned mine. Danny's hand found hers in the blackness. "There's a side tunnel about 30 feet ahead. Emergency exit the miners dug when they hit a gas pocket. It's narrow and steep, but it leads to the surface." They felt their way forward in the darkness, moving as quietly as possible. The voices ahead grew clearer, and Clara could make out enough words to realize that these were indeed the men who had taken Mrs. Walsh. Should have found her by now. Tracks lead into the mines. Can't let her reach Denver with those documents. Clara's heart hammered as she realized how close they had come to walking directly into their enemies. If not for Danny's knowledge of the tunnels, she would already be captured or dead. They found the side tunnel just as the approaching voices grew dangerously close. It was barely wide enough for one person, angling steeply upward through solid rock. Danny went first, helping Clara navigate the treacherous climb in absolute darkness. The ascent seemed to take forever. Clara's hands were soon scraped and bleeding from the rough rock, and her lungs burned from the thin air and physical exertion. But the alternative, capture by the men hunting her, drove her upward. Finally, they emerged through a concealed opening into daylight, finding themselves on a hillside overlooking Millbrook from the north. From this vantage point, Clara could see the mining office surrounded by horses and armed men, just as Danny had described. "Now what?" she asked, brushing dirt from her clothes. "Now we get creative." Danny was studying the scene below with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to solving practical problems. "See that building next to the mining office? That's the assay office. They share a common wall. Are you suggesting we break through the wall?" "I'm suggesting we use the skills Dr. Morrison taught me about geology and structural engineering." Danny's smile was grim. "Those men down there are watching the doors and windows. They're not watching for someone who understands how buildings are constructed." As they made their way down the hillside, staying out of sight of the riders below, Danny explained his plan. The assay office had been abandoned since the mines played out, but its basement connected to the mining office through what had once been a shared storage area. By entering through the assay office's rear window, they could reach the basement and then access the mining office without being seen. "What about the men inside the mining office?" Clara asked. "Won't they be suspicious of voices coming from the basement?" "Not if we're careful, and not if we can convince Dr. McKenna to come down to investigate." They reached the assay office as the afternoon sun began to cast long shadows across the town. The building was indeed abandoned, its windows boarded and its door secured with a rusty chain. But Danny had come prepared, producing a set of tools from his mining kit. "One advantage of working underground," he explained as he worked on the rear window. "You learn to get into places that aren't meant to be accessed." Inside, the assay office was thick with dust and the detritus of hasty abandonment. Old equipment sat covered in sheets, and papers were scattered across the floor where they had been dropped when the last assayer packed up and left town. The basement was reached through a narrow staircase that creaked ominously under their weight. In the dim light filtering through high windows, Clara could see the common wall that Danny had mentioned. It was newer construction, clearly built when the two buildings had been connected for convenience. Danny examined the wall carefully, running his hands over the mortar and testing the stability of individual stones. "This will work," he said finally. "The mortar's not properly cured, probably a rush job. We can remove enough stones to create an opening without bringing down the whole wall." As Danny began the delicate work of dismantling part of the wall, Clara kept watch and thought about what they would say to Dr. McKenna. The documents she carried were explosive, but they would need more than Samuel Morrison's suspicions to convince the authorities in Denver to take action. "Danny," she said quietly, "when we find Dr. McKenna, we need to ask him about the medical evidence. If the plague really was deliberately created, there should be signs that a trained doctor would recognize." "You mean like the immunity patterns Morrison was studying?" "Exactly. And maybe other things. The way the disease spreads, the specific symptoms, the mortality rates." Clara paused. "If we can prove that this plague is artificial, then we can prove that someone committed mass murder." Danny stopped his work and looked at her seriously. "You realize what you're saying? If this is true, then whoever's responsible has killed nearly 200 people just in Millbrook." And if they've done it here, they might have done it elsewhere, Clara finished. The scope of the potential crime was staggering, which means stopping them here might save thousands of lives. With renewed determination, Danny returned to his work on the wall. Within an hour, he had created an opening large enough for them to squeeze through. On the other side lay the basement of the mining office, and hopefully their first real ally in the fight to expose the truth about Millbrook's plague. As Clara prepared to crawl through the gap in the wall, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just 2 days. She had come to Millbrook expecting to be a bride. Instead, she was becoming something far more dangerous, a witness to murder and a threat to powerful people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But she was no longer the frightened woman who had fled Chicago. The challenges of the past 2 days had revealed strength she hadn't known she possessed. And now, with Danny as an ally and Dr. McKenna hopefully waiting just beyond the wall, she was ready to fight back against the forces that had destroyed Samuel Morrison and threatened to destroy Millbrook itself. The hunt for truth was about to begin in earnest, and Clara Bennett was no longer just prey. She was becoming a hunter in her own right. Clara squeezed through the gap in the wall, her dress catching on the rough stones as she emerged into the basement of the mining office. The space was larger than she had expected, filled with filing, cabinets, surveying equipment, and stacks of territorial mining claims that represented years of Colorado's silver boom. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through small windows near the ceiling. Danny followed close behind, carefully replacing several stones to disguise their entry point. Above them, they could hear muffled voices and the sound of footsteps on wooden floors. Dr. McKenna was somewhere in the building above, along with the other people trapped by the mysterious riders. "How do we get his attention without alerting everyone else?" Clara whispered. Danny studied the ceiling, noting the arrangement of support beams and floorboards. "The main office is directly above us. If we can create a small disturbance, something that sounds like settling timber or mice, Dr. McKenna might investigate." He moved to a section of the floor where a loose board could be manipulated from below. With careful pressure, he managed to create a series of soft, creaking sounds that could easily be mistaken for the normal noises of an old building. They waited in tense silence. Above them, the conversations continued unchanged. Danny tried again, this time creating a pattern of sounds, 3 short creaks, a pause, then 3 more. It was a simple code, but one that might catch the attention of someone with medical training who was accustomed to listening for subtle signs. After what seemed like an eternity, they heard footsteps approaching the basement door. A voice Clara recognized as Dr. McKenna called down quietly, "Hello? Is someone down there?" "Dr. McKenna," Clara called back softly. "It's Clara Bennett. I need to speak with you urgently." There was a pause, then the sound of a key in the lock. Dr. McKenna appeared at the top of the stairs, his medical bag in one hand and a lamp in the other. His face showed the strain of the past day, but his eyes sharpened with concern when he saw Clara. "Miss Bennett? How did you get down here? And who is this?" He descended the stairs, noting Danny's presence with professional curiosity. "Danny Reeves, sir. I worked with Dr. Morrison on his mining claim." Danny stepped forward respectfully. "We came through the old Silver Crown tunnels." Dr. McKenna's eyebrows rose. "That was extremely dangerous. Those tunnels have been condemned. For good reason. Not as dangerous as what's happening above ground," Clara said urgently. She pulled out Samuel Morrison's documents. "Dr. McKenna, we found these hidden in Dr. Morrison's desk. I think you need to see them immediately." Dr. McKenna took the papers and moved closer to his lamp for better light. As he read, his expression grew increasingly grave. Clara watched his face, seeing the moment when professional skepticism gave way to horrified understanding. "My God," he breathed. "Samuel suspected this was artificial?" "You don't sound surprised," Danny observed. Dr. McKenna looked up from the documents, his face pale in the lamplight. Because I've been having similar suspicions for weeks. The disease pattern, the specific mortality rates, the way it affects different populations. None of it follows the behavior of any natural pathogen I've studied. What kind of evidence? Clara asked. Dr. McKenna set down the lamp and pulled out a notebook from his medical bag. I've been documenting every case since the outbreak began. Look at this. He showed them a hand-drawn chart. Natural diseases typically show variation in how they affect different age groups, different physical conditions, different exposure levels. But this plague... Clara studied the chart. Even with her limited medical knowledge, she could see the unnaturally consistent patterns Dr. McKenna had identified. It's too precise, Danny said, understanding the dawning on his face, like it was designed to behave this way. Exactly. And there's more. Dr. McKenna flipped to another page in his notebook. I've identified at least 12 people in Millbrook who show complete immunity to the disease. Not resistance, complete immunity. They've been directly exposed multiple times without showing any symptoms. Like you and Mrs. Walsh, Clara said, and Danny here apparently. Dr. McKenna studied the young miner with new interest. You've been exposed to infected individuals, haven't you? Danny nodded. My sister died in my arms. I nursed her for 3 days before the end, never got sick. That's not how natural diseases work, Dr. McKenna explained. Natural pathogens don't create neat categories of immune and non-immune individuals, but artificially created biological agents. The implications hung heavy in the air. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool basement air. Someone created this plague deliberately. It appears so. And if Samuel's correspondence is accurate, he was getting close to proving it when he died. Which means he was murdered, Danny said grimly. Dr. McKenna nodded slowly. I believe so. And I think I know how. He led them to a corner of the basement, where several wooden crates were stacked. These are medical supplies that were delivered to Millbrook just before the outbreak began. I've been reviewing the shipping manifests, and there are discrepancies. Clara examined the papers he showed her. These supplies came from the Territorial Medical Office in Denver? Supposedly. But when I telegraphed Denver to request additional supplies, they had no record of sending these shipments. Dr. McKenna's voice was tight with controlled anger. Someone used official channels to deliver contaminated materials to Millbrook. What kind of materials? Danny asked. Dr. McKenna opened one of the crates, revealing bottles of medicine and medical instruments. Water purification tablets, antiseptic, solutions, bandages, all the things a frontier town would need for basic medical care. But I suspect some of these items were contaminated with the plague agent. Clara picked up one of the bottles, studying the official-looking label. How can we prove it? We'd need laboratory facilities that don't exist in Millbrook, but there's another approach. Dr. McKenna closed the crate and turned to face them. If we can trace where these supplies really came from, we might be able to identify who's behind the outbreak. The men upstairs, Clara said suddenly, they're looking for evidence of exactly this kind of investigation. They knew Dr. Morrison was getting close to the truth, which means our lives are in immediate danger, Dr. McKenna observed. How many of them are there? 4 that we've seen, Danny replied. Well-armed and organized. They've got Mrs. Walsh. Prisoner. Dr. McKenna's expression darkened. Mrs. Walsh was captured? When? Clara quickly explained the morning's events, from finding the documents to their escape through the mines. Dr. McKenna listened with growing concern, occasionally asking for clarification about specific details. We need to get this information to the authorities in Denver, he said when she finished. But first, we need to gather more evidence. The documents Samuel left are compelling, but they're not proof. We need something concrete. What about the contaminated medical supplies? Clara suggested. Useful, but not definitive. What we need is proof of the delivery system, how the plague agent was introduced into Millbrook's population. Dr. McKenna paused, thinking. Danny, you mentioned that your sister was among the early victims. Do you remember anything unusual about her final days? Any medical treatment she received? Danny's face tightened with pain, but he answered steadily. She went to see Dr. Morrison when she first took sick. He gave her medicine, some kind of tonic to help with the fever. Do you still have that medicine? Maybe. Sarah lived with Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house before she died. Her things might still be there. Clara remembered the boarding house from their arrival, the building with multiple quarantine markers where 7 people had died. In the first week, that building is sealed under quarantine, Dr. McKenna said. But if we could get inside, examine any remaining medicine bottles. I know a way in, Danny said. The boarding house backs up to Wilkins Creek. There's a root cellar that opens directly to the creek bank. Mrs. Patterson used it to store vegetables and preserve food. Another underground approach, Clara observed. These mountain towns are full of cellars, tunnels, and hidden spaces, Danny explained. Necessary when you're dealing with harsh winters and the need to store supplies. Dr. McKenna made a decision. We'll go tonight after dark, but first I need to deal with the situation upstairs. The people trapped with me need to know what's happening. Is that wise? Clara asked. If those riders are listening, I'll be careful. But these people deserve to know they're in danger from more than just disease. Dr. McKenna gathered his documents and prepared to return upstairs. Meet me at the creek behind the boarding house at midnight. And Miss Bennet? Yes? Bring those documents. If we find what I think we'll find in the boarding house, we'll have enough evidence to expose this conspiracy. After Dr. McKenna left, Clara and Danny settled in to wait. The basement was cold and uncomfortable, but it felt safer than venturing. Outside, where the mysterious riders continued their patrol. Danny, Clara said as they huddled near the lamp for warmth, why are you helping me? You barely know me, and this is incredibly dangerous. Danny was quiet for a moment, staring at the flame. My sister Sarah was all the family I had left. Our parents died in a mining accident when she was 5. I raised her, protected her, did everything I could to give her a chance at a good life. His voice was thick with emotion. When she got sick, I felt so helpless. The doctors tried, but there was nothing they could do. I'm sorry, Clara said softly. But now, finding out that her death might not have been natural, that someone might have deliberately killed her and all the others. Danny's hands clenched into fists. I can't bring Sarah back, but maybe I can prevent this from happening to other people's sisters and brothers and children. Clara understood. They were both driven by loss, both seeking a way to make meaning from tragedy. Samuel Morrison's death had brought her to Millbrook, but Sarah Reeves' death had given Danny a reason to fight. As they waited for nightfall, Clara studied the medical supply crates more carefully. The labels were professional and convincing, but small details didn't quite match what she would expect from legitimate territorial shipments. The paper quality was slightly different, the printing not quite aligned, the official seals just slightly off. These are forgeries, she realized. Someone went to considerable trouble to create convincing fake medical supplies. Which means this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision, Danny said. This was planned well in advance. But why Millbrook? Why target this specific town? Danny considered the question. Remote location, limited communication with the outside. World, small enough population to serve as a test case, but large enough to provide meaningful data. The cold calculation of it made Clara's stomach turn. Millbrook hadn't been randomly chosen. It had been selected as a testing ground for biological warfare. As darkness fell outside, they prepared for their midnight mission to the boarding house. Clara checked that Samuel Morrison's documents were securely hidden in her coat, while Danny gathered tools that might be useful for breaking into the sealed building. "Once we're inside the boarding house," Danny warned, "we need to work quickly. Those buildings under quarantine are officially off limits, and if the riders spot us going in—" Clara nodded, understanding. They would have one chance to find the evidence they needed. At 11:30, they made their way carefully through Millbrook's dark streets. The town seemed even more deserted at night, with most of the surviving residents barricaded behind locked doors and shuttered windows. The mysterious riders had established a patrol pattern that Danny had observed during their wait, but timing would be crucial. They reached Wilkins Creek without incident. The boarding house loomed above them, dark and forbidding with its official quarantine seals and abandoned appearance. But Danny had been right about the root cellar. Its entrance was hidden among the creek bank vegetation, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Dr. McKenna was already waiting when they arrived, his medical bag supplemented with additional supplies for their investigation. In the moonlight, his face was grim but determined. "Any problems getting away from the mining office?" Clara asked quietly. "I told the others I was going to check on some patients. They don't expect me back until morning." Dr. McKenna examined the root cellar entrance. "This leads directly into the boarding house?" "Into the basement," Danny confirmed. "From there, we can access the main floors where the guests stayed." The root cellar was damp and narrow, with stone walls that wept moisture from the creek above. They moved single file by lamplight, Clara trying not to think about the people who had died in the building they were about to enter. The basement of the boarding house was larger than the mining office, designed to store food and supplies for a business that catered to travelers and long-term boarders. But what caught their attention immediately were the medical supplies scattered across several tables. "Someone was treating patients down here," Dr. McKenna observed, examining the makeshift medical station. Recently, by the look of it, Clara studied the bottles and instruments. Many bore the same suspicious labels they had seen in the mining office basement. "These are the contaminated supplies?" "Very likely." Dr. McKenna began carefully collecting samples, using clean cloth to avoid direct contact. "If we can get these to a proper laboratory in Denver—" A sound from upstairs interrupted him, footsteps moving across the floor above their heads. Danny immediately extinguished his lamp, plunging them into darkness. They stood frozen, listening as the footsteps moved methodically through the boarding. "House rooms above. Someone searching the building," Dr. McKenna whispered. The footsteps paused directly above them, and Clara held her breath. Had they been discovered? Were the mysterious riders conducting their own investigation of the quarantined building? After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved on, continuing their systematic search of the upper floors. But the message was clear. They were not alone in their investigation, and their enemies were closing in. "We need to finish here quickly," Dr. McKenna said, relighting his lamp with shaking hands. Working as fast as they dared, they gathered evidence from the basement medical station. Contaminated supply bottles, suspicious medicines, and most importantly, a patient log that detailed who had received treatment and when. "Look at this," Clara said, studying the log by lamplight. "The deaths follow a specific pattern based on which medicines were administered." Dr. McKenna examined the entries. "This is it. This is proof that the plague was deliberately introduced. Through contaminated medical treatment. They had found their smoking gun, but as the footsteps above continued their methodical search, Clara realized that their discovery might have come too late. The hunters had become the hunted, and escape from the boarding house was looking increasingly unlikely. The truth about Millbrook's plague was finally within their grasp, but staying alive long enough to expose it would require all their courage and ingenuity. The most dangerous part of their investigation was just beginning. The footsteps above grew closer, and Clara could hear voices now. At least 3 men moving through the boarding house, with military precision. Dr. McKenna hastily stuffed the medical evidence into his bag, while Danny extinguished the lamp, leaving them in near total darkness, save for thin moonlight filtering through high basement windows. "The root cellar," Danny whispered urgently. "We need to get back to the creek." But as they moved toward their escape route, the sound of boots on wooden stairs echoed through the basement. Someone was coming down. Too late, Dr. McKenna breathed. Clara's mind raced. They were trapped in the basement with incriminating evidence, and their enemies were about to discover them. But then she remembered something from her desperate flight that morning. These men wanted her alive, at least long enough to recover Samuel Morrison's documents. "Dr. McKenna, Danny, hide behind those supply barrels," she whispered urgently. "I'm going to create a distraction." "Absolutely not," Dr. McKenna protested. "We stay together. They want me and the documents. If I can draw them away from here, you can escape with the medical evidence." Clara was already moving toward the stairs. "Get that proof to Denver. It's the only way to stop this." Before either man could stop her, Clara stepped into the open area of the basement just as a lamp appeared at the top of the stairs. The beam of light found her immediately, and she raised her hands as if in surrender. "Don't shoot!" she called, out trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm Clara Bennett. I believe you've been looking for me." The man with the lamp descended the stairs, his pistol drawn but not yet aimed at her. In the lamplight, Clara could see he was the same military-looking leader she had glimpsed at Samuel Morrison's house that morning. Behind him came two other men, both armed and alert. "Miss Bennett," the leader said, his voice cultured but cold, "you've caused us considerable trouble today. I'm Colonel Marcus Thornfield, and I represent certain government interests that require your cooperation." "Government interests?" Clara fought to keep the skepticism out of her voice. "What government sanctions the murder of innocent civilians?" Thornfield's expression didn't change. "I'm afraid you've misunderstood the situation. The events in Millbrook are part of a necessary field test of defensive measures against biological warfare. The territorial authorities have been fully informed. Defensive measures." Clara felt sick. "You killed nearly 200 people as a defensive measure. The development of effective countermeasures requires understanding how biological agents behave in real-world conditions," Thornfield replied, as if discussing the weather. "Millbrook was selected as an isolated test site where casualties could be contained while data was gathered." The casual way he discussed mass murder made Clara's blood run cold. "And Dr. Morrison discovered what you were doing." Dr. Morrison exceeded his role in the experiment. He was supposed to document medical outcomes, not investigate origins. Thornfield stepped closer. His communications with Denver threatened to compromise a vital military research program. "So you murdered him." Dr. Morrison's death was necessary to preserve operational security. Thornfield's pistol was now pointed directly at Clara. "Just as your death will be necessary if you don't cooperate." From behind the supply barrels, Clara could hear the faintest whisper of movement. Dr. McKenna and Danny were still hidden, but for how long? "What do you want?" Clara asked, trying to keep Thornfield's attention focused on her. "The documents Dr. Morrison hid, obviously, along with any evidence you may have gathered during your rather impressive investigation today." Thornfield smiled, coldly. "Yes, Miss Bennett, we've been watching you. Your escape through the mining tunnels was quite resourceful." Clara's heart sank. If they had been watching her, they might know about Dr. McKenna and Danny as well. "The documents are hidden," she said. "I can retrieve them, but not from down here. I think not. My men have already searched Dr. Morrison's house thoroughly. The documents aren't there." Thornfield studied her face in the lamplight. "You have them with you, don't you?" Before Clara could respond, one of Thornfield's men called down from upstairs. "Colonel, we've got movement outside. Looks like townspeople gathering in the street." Thornfield cursed under his breath. "How many?" "Difficult to tell in the dark, but at least a dozen. They're carrying torches and firearms." Clara felt a surge of hope. Had the survivors of Millbrook finally decided to take action against their mysterious oppressors? "It seems your friends have decided to intervene," Thornfield said grimly. "No matter. We'll deal with them as we dealt with the others who became inconvenient." The casual threat against innocent people sparked something fierce in Clara. These men had already killed Samuel Morrison, captured Mrs. Walsh, and murdered hundreds of civilians. She would not let them harm anyone else. "Colonel Thornfield," she said, stepping forward despite the pistol aimed at her chest. "I have a proposition." "I'm listening. I'll give you the documents, but only if you release Mrs. Walsh and leave Millbrook immediately. No more deaths, no more threats." Thornfield laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate, Miss Bennet. You're surrounded, outnumbered, and completely at my mercy." "Am I?" Clara smiled grimly. "Because it sounds like the entire surviving population of Millbrook is gathering outside this building, and they're armed." As if to emphasize her point, voices could now be heard from the street, angry voices demanding answers and justice. Thornfield's confidence wavered slightly. "What do they know?" "Everything," Clara lied smoothly. "Dr. McKenna has been sharing information with the other survivors all day. They know about the contaminated medical supplies, the artificial plague, the government experiment. Right now, they're probably preparing to send riders to Denver with the full story." The sound of breaking glass from upstairs interrupted their conversation. Someone had thrown something through one of the boarding house windows. "We know you're in there," a voice shouted from outside. Clara recognized it as Mrs. Chen. "Release Miss Bennet and Dr. McKenna, or we're coming in." Thornfield's jaw tightened. The situation was spiraling beyond his control, and Clara could see him calculating options. "Sir," one of his men called down urgently, "they're surrounding the building, and there are more coming. Looks like people from the mining camps up the valley." Clara's heart leaped. Word was spreading beyond Millbrook itself. The conspiracy that had thrived in secrecy was being exposed to daylight. "Colonel," she said quietly, "you have a choice. Leave now while you still can, or face the consequences when this story reaches the territorial authorities in Denver." "The territorial authorities are complicit in this operation," Thornfield snapped. "All of them?" Clara challenged. "Every official, every newspaper, every federal marshal. Because that's who will be asking questions when the survivors of Millbrook start talking." From behind the supply barrels, Dr. McKenna's voice suddenly rang out clearly. "Colonel Thornfield, this is Dr. James McKenna. I have medical evidence proving that the plague affecting Millbrook was artificially created and deliberately introduced through contaminated medical supplies." Thornfield spun toward the sound, his pistol shifting away from Clara. "Dr. McKenna, how convenient. You can join Miss Bennet in our custody." "I think not." Dr. McKenna stepped into view, his hands raised, but his voice steady. "The evidence I've gathered has already been copied and hidden. If anything happens to me, it will automatically be forwarded to federal authorities." It was a bluff, but a convincing one. Thornfield hesitated, clearly weighing his options. That moment of hesitation was all Danny needed. He emerged from behind, the barrels not with his hands raised, but with a stick of dynamite in one hand and a lit candle in the other. "Nobody moves," Danny said calmly, "or we all go up together." Thornfield's men immediately trained their weapons on Danny, but the young miner just smiled grimly. "Go ahead and shoot," he said, "but if this candle drops, the whole building goes. And from the sound of things outside, there are a lot of innocent people who might get hurt in the explosion." Clara stared at Danny in amazement. "Where did you get dynamite?" "Mining supplies," he replied without taking his eyes off Thornfield. "Always carry some for emergencies. And Colonel, This definitely qualifies as an emergency. The standoff stretched taut as a wire. Thornfield's men had their weapons drawn, but Danny's threat was credible and potentially catastrophic for everyone in the building. The sound of voices outside grew louder and more organized. Someone was directing the crowd, turning an angry mob into a coordinated force. "Colonel Thornfield," a new voice called from outside, this one with unmistakable authority. "This is Marshal James Wallace of the United States Marshal Service. You and your men are surrounded. Come out with your hands visible." Clara's knees nearly buckled with relief. A federal marshal had arrived in Millbrook, but how had he learned about the situation so quickly? Thornfield's face went white. "That's impossible. Wallace is supposed to be in Wyoming." "Apparently not," Dr. McKenna observed dryly. The basement fell silent, except for the sound of boots on the porch above, and Marshal Wallace's voice calling out commands to position his men around the building. "Colonel," Clara said quietly, "it's over. Your experiment failed the moment you underestimated the people of Millbrook." Thornfield looked around the basement, calculating odds that were rapidly becoming impossible. His men were outnumbered, surrounded, and facing a federal marshal with legitimate authority. The conspiracy he had worked to protect was crumbling around him. "Sir," one of his men asked nervously, "what are your orders?" For a moment, Clara thought, Thornfield might surrender, but then his expression hardened with the resolve of a man who had nothing left to lose. "The operation must be protected," he said coldly, raising his pistol toward Clara. "Even if it means eliminating all witnesses." Danny's grip tightened on the dynamite. "Don't even think about it." "You won't detonate that explosive," Thornfield said confidently. "You'd kill everyone in this basement, including Miss Bennett and Dr. McKenna." "Maybe," Danny replied, "but I'd also kill you and your men, and the evidence of your crimes would survive to reach Denver." Clara realized that Danny was right. If they died here, their sacrifice would still expose the truth about Millbrook's plague, but she wasn't ready to give up yet. "Colonel Thornfield," she said, her voice carrying the authority she had once used to control unruly classrooms, "look around you. Your mission has already failed. The people of Millbrook know the truth. A federal marshal is outside. The evidence of your crimes is documented and witnessed." She took a step closer to him, ignoring the pistol aimed at her heart. "You can kill us, but you can't kill the truth. And when that truth reaches Washington, your entire program will be exposed. Every official who authorized this atrocity will face justice." "The program is too important to fail," Thornfield insisted, but Clara could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. "Important enough to justify murdering American citizens, including children?" Clara thought of Danny's sister Sarah, of all the innocent people who had died for Thornfield's experiment. "What kind of defense requires attacking your own people?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Thornfield's eyes. The moral weight of his actions was finally breaking through his military conditioning. The sound of splintering wood from upstairs interrupted the tense confrontation. Marshal Wallace and his deputies were forcing their way into the boarding house. "Time's up, Colonel," Dr. McKenna said quietly. "Surrender now, and you might live to face trial." Thornfield looked around the basement one final time, seeing his situation with brutal clarity. His men were wavering, the building was surrounded, and his enemies held evidence that could destroy not just him, but the entire biological warfare program. "Sir?" his sergeant asked urgently. "Orders!" Thornfield slowly lowered his pistol. "Stand down," he said quietly. "The mission is compromised." Clara felt her legs give way as relief flooded through her. Danny carefully moved the candle away from the dynamite, and Dr. McKenna stepped forward to secure Thornfield's weapon. Heavy footsteps thundered down the basement stairs as Marshal Wallace and his deputies took control of the situation. The federal marshal was a tall, weathered man with the bearing of someone accustomed to dangerous assignments and difficult decisions. "Miss Bennett?" he asked. identifying Clara immediately. "Are you injured?" "No, Marshal. But there are others who need help. Mrs. Walsh was taken prisoner, and the people of Millbrook have suffered terribly." Wallace nodded grimly. "We'll address all of that. But first, I need to understand exactly what happened here." As Thornfield and his men were placed under arrest, Clara found herself finally able to process the magnitude of what they had uncovered. The plague that had devastated Millbrook was not a natural disaster, but a deliberate act of biological warfare. Samuel Morrison had died because he had gotten too close to the truth. And she, Danny, and Dr. McKenna had risked everything to expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. "How did you find us, Marshal?" Dr. McKenna asked as they prepared to leave the basement. Wallace smiled grimly. A very determined telegram operator in Denver received some interesting communications about biological warfare experiments in Colorado. When I investigated, I found that several territorial officials were quite nervous about anyone asking questions about Millbrook. "Mrs. Walsh," Clara said suddenly, "do you know where they're holding her?" "Already freed," Wallace assured her. "We found her locked in a mining shack about 2 miles from town. She's shaken but unharmed, and she had quite a lot to say about Colonel Thornfield's activities." As they emerged from the boarding house into the crisp mountain air, Clara was amazed to see nearly 50 people gathered in the street. The entire surviving population of Millbrook had turned out, along with miners and their families from the surrounding camps. They had risked everything to stand against Thornfield and his men. Mrs. Chen approached Clara with tears in her eyes. "Miss Bennett, we heard shots. We thought you might be dead." "Very much alive, thanks to all of you," Clara replied, embracing the older woman. "Your courage made the difference." Danny appeared at her side, his face grim but satisfied. "It's over," he said simply. "Sarah and all the others can rest in peace now." Dr. McKenna joined them, his medical bag packed with evidence that would help convict not just Thornfield, but potentially dozens of officials involved in the biological warfare program. "What happens now?" Clara asked Marshal Wallace. "Trials, investigations, and hopefully justice," Wallace replied. "The territorial government will have some explaining to do, and federal authorities will need to determine how far this conspiracy reached." As the crowd began to disperse and Thornfield's men were led away in shackles, Clara realized that her journey to Millbrook was finally complete. She had come seeking a husband and found instead a purpose she never could have imagined. The plague was over, the conspiracy exposed, and the survivors of Millbrook could begin the long process of rebuilding their lives. But for Clara Bennett, the real question was just beginning. What would she do with the future she had fought so hard to secure? The answer to that question would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of a town that had learned the true meaning of courage in the face of impossible odds. 3 months after the arrest of Colonel Thornfield and his men, Clara Bennett stood in the main courtroom of the Denver Federal Building, watching as the final defendant in the biological warfare conspiracy received his sentence. Judge Harrison's voice carried the weight of moral authority as he condemned not just the individuals involved, but the system that had allowed such atrocities to occur. The court finds that the defendants engaged in a deliberate program of biological warfare against American civilians, Judge Harrison declared. This represents not merely murder, but an act of domestic terrorism that strikes at the very foundation of our democratic society. Clara listened as Thornfield received a sentence of death by hanging, while his subordinates were sentenced to life imprisonment. The lesser officials who had facilitated the program received terms ranging from 10 to 20 years. It was justice, but it came at a cost that could never be fully repaid. Beside her in the courtroom gallery sat Dr. McKenna, now appointed as the new territorial health officer for Colorado, and Danny Reeves, who had become something of a folk hero for his role in exposing the conspiracy. Mrs. Walsh sat nearby, having recovered from her ordeal, to become a vocal advocate for the victims' families. The trials had attracted national attention, with newspaper correspondents from as far away as New York covering the proceedings. The story of a mail-order bride who had uncovered a government conspiracy had captured the public imagination, but Clara found herself uncomfortable with the attention. After the court session concluded, the group gathered outside the federal building in the crisp April air. Denver was bustling with spring activity, a stark contrast to the quiet desperation they had left behind in Millbrook. "It's finally over," Dr. McKenna said, his voice carrying a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. The past 3 months had been grueling, with depositions, testimony, and the constant pressure of national scrutiny. "Is it, though?" Danny asked, looking up at the imposing government buildings around them. "How do we know there aren't other programs like Thornfield operating somewhere else?" It was a sobering thought. The trials had revealed that the biological warfare program had been larger than anyone initially suspected, with test sites planned for several remote communities across the West. Millbrook had been just the beginning. "That's why congressional hearings are starting next month," Clara replied. She had been subpoenaed to testify before Congress about the entire affair, a prospect that both thrilled and terrified her. "The goal is to ensure this never happens again." Mrs. Walsh approached, their group, her expression thoughtful. "Miss Bennett, have you decided what you'll do after the congressional testimony? You've had offers from newspapers, book publishers, even lecture circuits." Clara had indeed received numerous offers to tell her story in various formats. Publishers wanted to turn her experiences into a sensational novel. Newspapers offered her positions as a correspondent covering women's issues. Lecture organizers promised substantial fees for speaking engagements about courage and survival. "I'm still considering my options," Clara said diplomatically. The truth was more complicated. The attention made her uncomfortable, and she wasn't sure she wanted to spend her life defined by a few traumatic days in a plague-stricken town. "What about Millbrook?" Dr. McKenna asked quietly. "The town is rebuilding. They could use someone with your organizational skills and determination." It was true. Millbrook was slowly recovering from the devastation of Thornfield's experiment. The territorial government had provided compensation to the survivors and funding for reconstruction. New families were moving in, drawn by generous land grants and the promise of a fresh start. But the town needed leadership, and many of the survivors had looked to Clara for guidance during the trials. "I've been thinking about that," Clara admitted. "But I'm not sure what I could contribute. I'm not a doctor or a miner or a business owner." "You're a teacher," Danny pointed out, "and Millbrook needs a school more than anything else. The children who survived need education, and the new families coming in will need schools for their children too." Clara had been thinking about teaching again. It was what she had done in Boston, what she was trained for, what gave her life meaning beyond the dramatic events that had brought her fame. "There's something else," Dr. McKenna said, his voice carefully neutral. "The territorial government has offered to fund a comprehensive medical research facility in Millbrook. They want to study disease prevention and public health measures to prevent future outbreaks. And," Clara sensed there was more to his announcement, "they've asked me to head the facility. It would mean staying in Millbrook permanently, conducting research that could help communities across the West." Dr. McKenna paused. "I wanted you to know before I made my decision." Clara felt her heart skip a beat. Over the past 3 months, she and Dr. McKenna had developed a close friendship built on shared experiences and mutual respect. But there had been something else growing between them. something neither had acknowledged openly during the intensity of the trials and investigations. "That sounds like an important opportunity," she said carefully. "It is, but it would also mean giving up other opportunities. There are positions available at universities back east, research hospitals in major cities." Dr. McKenna's eyes met hers. "I wanted to discuss the decision with someone whose opinion I value." Before Clara could respond, Marshal Wallace approached their group. The federal marshal had become something of a friend during the long months of legal proceedings, and Clara had come to respect his steady competence and dry sense of humor. "Miss Bennet," Wallace said, tipping his hat, "I wanted to let you know that we've received word from Washington about your congressional testimony. They're particularly interested in your recommendations for preventing similar incidents in the future." "I'm honored by their confidence," Clara replied, "though I'm not sure what expertise I can offer." "You can offer the perspective of someone who lived through it," Wallace said seriously, "who saw how quickly a community can be destroyed when people in power prioritize secrecy over human life." That evening, Clara found herself alone in her Denver hotel room, staring out at the city lights and trying to make sense of the choices before her. The woman who had fled Chicago 6 months ago with nothing but a carpet bag and a handful of letters seemed like a different person entirely. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Dr. McKenna standing in the hallway, his expression uncertain. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, "but I realized we never finished our conversation about the future." Clara stepped aside to let him enter. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the research facility in Millbrook, and I've been thinking about a lot of things." Clara moved to the window, looking out at the bustling city below. 6 months ago, I thought I knew exactly what I wanted from life. A husband, a home, security. Simple things. "Those are still worthy goals," Dr. McKenna said gently. "Are they? Or are they just safe goals?" Clara turned to face him. "What happened in Millbrook showed me that I'm capable of more than I ever imagined. I survived things I never thought I could survive. I helped expose a conspiracy that could have killed thousands more people. You did far more than survive, Clara. You led. You made decisions under pressure that saved lives and brought criminals to justice." The use of her first name sent a flutter through Clara's chest. Over the months, their relationship had gradually shifted from formal courtesy to genuine friendship, but this felt like another step forward. "James," she said, using his first name deliberately, "what if I told you I've made a decision about my future?" "I'd ask what you've decided." Clara took a deep breath. "I've decided to return to Millbrook, not because I'm running away from opportunities, but because I think I can do the most good there." Relief flooded across Dr. McKenna's face. The teaching position, yes, but more than that, Millbrook needs to become something more than just a mining town that survived a plague. It needs to become a symbol of what communities can accomplish when they work together. And the research facility? I think you should accept the position. Clara stepped closer to him. "I think we could accomplish great things together, James. You conducting medical research and educating the next generation. Building something lasting from the ashes of what Thornfield tried to destroy." Dr. McKenna's expression grew serious. "Clara, I need to be honest with you about something. My feelings for you have grown beyond friendship and respect. If we're going to work together in Millbrook, if we're going to build something together, I want it to be as partners in every sense of the word." Clara felt her heart racing. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking if you would consider it, not because you need protection or security, but because I believe we could build a life together that would honor both what we've survived and what we hope to accomplish." Clara thought of Samuel Morrison's letters, of the woman she had been when she first read his promises of a new life in the West. That woman had been seeking escape and security. But the woman she had become was seeking something far more meaningful: purpose, partnership, and the opportunity to make a real difference in the world. "James McKenna," she said, moving close enough to take his hands in hers, "I came to Colorado expecting to marry a man I knew only through letters. Instead, I found a man I know through shared danger, mutual respect, and common purpose. Is that a yes?" "It's a yes to marriage, yes to partnership, and yes to building something extraordinary in Millbrook." Clara smiled. "Though I think we should have a proper courtship first. The people of Millbrook deserve to see their doctor and their teacher conducting themselves with appropriate propriety." Dr. McKenna laughed, the first truly joyful sound Clara had heard from him in months. "How long a courtship do you think would be appropriate? Long enough for us to establish the school and the research facility. Long enough to show the world that Millbrook is more than just a victim of government conspiracy." Clara paused thoughtfully. "Perhaps by Christmas?" "Christmas seems perfect," Dr. McKenna agreed. "A new beginning to mark the end of a very difficult year." 2 weeks later, Clara found herself once again on a stagecoach bound for Millbrook. But this time, her circumstances were entirely different. Instead of fleeing Chicago with nothing but hope and fear, she was returning to Colorado with purpose, resources, and plans for the future. The territorial government had provided generous funding for both the new school and the medical research facility. Clara carried with her textbooks, supplies, and the authority to hire additional teachers as Millbrook's population grew. Dr. McKenna traveled separately with equipment and supplies for his laboratory, along with 2 research assistants recruited from Denver Medical College. As the stagecoach crested the familiar hill overlooking Millbrook, Clara was amazed by the transformation. New buildings dotted the townscape, including a proper schoolhouse, a modern medical facility, and a hotel designed to accommodate the visitors and researchers who were beginning to take interest in the town's remarkable recovery. But more than the physical changes, Clara could sense a different spirit in Millbrook. The survivors of Thornfield's experiment had not merely endured, they had transformed their experience into a source of strength and purpose. Mrs. Chen met Clara at the stagecoach stop, her face beaming with welcome. "Miss Bennet, or should I say our new schoolmistress?" "Clara will do fine," Clara replied, embracing the older woman warmly. "How are the preparations for the school coming along?" "Wonderfully. We have 37 children enrolled from ages 5 to 16. Some are survivors from the original families, others have come with the new settlers." Mrs. Chen's pride was evident. They're all eager to meet their new teacher. That evening, the town held a welcome celebration for Clara and Dr. McKenna at the new community hall. It was a far different gathering than the desperate crowd that had surrounded the boarding house 6 months earlier. This was a community celebrating hope and new beginnings. Danny Reeves had used his newfound fame to establish a successful mining consultation business, helping other communities avoid the safety problems that had plagued Millbrook's early mining operations. He approached Clara during the celebration with a special announcement. "I wanted you to be among the first to know," he said with a grin. "I'm getting married next month to Sarah's best friend, Mary Patterson. She survived the plague. And we found comfort in shared memories of Sarah." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. "Danny, that's wonderful news. Sarah would be so happy for you both." "I like to think so." "And Miss Bennet, Clara, I wanted to thank you again. Not just for helping expose the truth about the plague, but for showing me that surviving tragedy doesn't have to mean just existing. You showed me it's possible to build something meaningful from loss." Similar conversations filled the evening as Clara reconnected with the people who had become her chosen family. Mrs. Walsh had opened a boarding house that catered to the researchers and visitors drawn to Millbrook's story. The proprietor of the general store had expanded into a mail-order business, shipping mountain herbs and remedies across the West. Even the children who had survived the plague were thriving, their resilience and determination inspiring everyone around them. As the evening wound down, Clara found herself standing outside the community hall with Dr. McKenna, looking up at the same stars that had witnessed so much tragedy and triumph in Millbrook. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. Clara considered the question seriously, about leaving the opportunities in Denver, about choosing a small mountain town over a chance at fame and fortune. "About any of it. No regrets," Clara said firmly. "I came to Millbrook looking for a simple life, and instead I found something much more valuable. I found purpose, community, and—" She looked up at Dr. McKenna. "I found love that's based on who we really are, not who we imagine ourselves to be." Dr. McKenna took her hand gently. "I love you, Clara Bennett. Not the famous woman who exposed a government conspiracy, but the teacher who cares about children's futures, the partner who sees possibilities where others see problems, the woman who chose purpose over profit. And I love you, James McKenna, the doctor who risked everything to save his community, the researcher who wants to prevent future tragedies, the man who chose healing over harm." As they walked together through the quiet streets of Millbrook, Clara reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. She had come west as a mail-order bride, seeking escape from an impossible situation. She was staying as a teacher, researcher's partner, and community leader who had found her true calling. The plague that had nearly destroyed Millbrook had instead revealed the extraordinary strength and resilience of ordinary people. The conspiracy that had been designed to test biological weapons had instead tested the bonds of community and the power of truth to overcome injustice. And Clara Bennett, who had once thought her only options were spinsterhood or marriage to a stranger, had discovered that the most meaningful choice was to build a life based on love, purpose, and service to others. As winter approached and their Christmas wedding drew near, Clara knew that her journey to Millbrook was finally complete. Not because she had found what she was looking for, but because she had discovered who she was meant to become. The mail-order bride who had arrived to find her groom dead had become something far more powerful, a woman who had chosen her own destiny and helped others do the same. In the clear mountain air of Colorado, under stars that had witnessed both humanity's capacity for evil and its potential for redemption, Clara Bennett had found her home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.